clinical assistant professor of pharmacy practice at Campbell University. He also serves as chair of the pharmacy student education at Duke Regional Hospital. He maintains a practice at Duke Regional, where he works in adult internal medicine and surgery. He precepts internal medicine 1 and 2 APE rotations, along with multiple pharmacy resident rotations. Dr. Darkow graduated from Campbell University College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences in 2017. He completed a pharmacy practice PGY1 residency at Duke Regional, followed by a PGY2 residency in internal medicine and academia at Duke Regional. He last presented at AAPT convention in North Carolina. Please welcome back Dr. Darkow.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I think, yep, that works. All right. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. As he mentioned, I work as an assistant professor at Campbell University, so go Camels. I saw that there were some people in attendance from North Carolina. Very nice. Awesome. Well, we made it this far out. This is a little further from home than the last time I presented in Raleigh, but very beautiful. So today we're going to talk about biologics and biosimilars. So who here has worked with biologics or biosimilars? All right, I'm seeing a few hands. So biologics and biosimilars have really changed the landscape of a lot of different disease states over the last 10 to 15 years. And as more and more are reaching market and we're dispensing more of them, we get a lot of questions. What is a biologic? What makes a medication a biologic? What's a biosimilar? If we have biologics, why do we need biosimilars? How similar are they? And what's up with the random 4-letter abbreviation at the end of biosimilars? Who decided on what those 4 letters are? So today we'll decode some of that logic of biologics and biosimilars. So our objectives, we're going to define and differentiate the fundamental characteristics of biologics and biosimilars. What are these medicines? Examine the regulatory pathways surrounding them and evaluate how they are approved for use in patients. And then we're going to describe some of the more recent and cutting-edge clinical applications and economic impacts for patients of biologics and biosimilar medications. So first, we'll start with an introduction to biologics and biosimilars. What are these medications? So what is a biological product, also known as a biologic? So a biologic is a large, complex molecule made of living sources, such as bacteria, yeasts, and animal cells. So that's really the essential differentiating factor, that these are derived from living sources. They're not chemically synthesized like most medications that we think of as we dispense. And one other thing I wanted to point out is you can see how much larger these biologics are compared to a typical medication. So we see this large monoclonal antibody. It's a biologic medication. Compare that to the small aspirin molecule, which is just next to that biologic medicine. So these are much larger, more complex medications compared to typical medications that we're typically used to dispensing. So a biological product, there's a really wide range of types of products. So vaccines are considered biologics because they're derived from bacterial antigens that are either inactivated or weakened, or potentially viral antigens or proteins. Blood products are biologics, allergenics that we can use to identify patients with certain allergies or desensitize them if they have these allergies. And then cellular and gene therapies are really on the cutting edge of medication therapy in the last decade. Cellular therapies such as stem cell transplant for patients that have lymphomas or leukemias, where we're replenishing their cellular stores of medications. And then gene therapies, where we may modify one of the patient's genes or introduce a new gene into the patient to help reproduce cells, such as in muscular dystrophy or other disease states where different tissues need to be replenished or restored. And these biologics are typically composed of larger molecules, sugars, proteins, nucleic acids, large living cells and tissues, and they can be derived from humans, animals, or microorganisms. wide range of products, and this is just a list of some of the more commonly used biologic medications, such as if you look down the left-hand side, you may start to think to yourself, I actually have been involved in the dispensing of biologic medications. I didn't even realize it. So adalimumab, Humira, alemtuzumab. If you go down a little bit further, you'll see insulin is considered a biologic product. It was traditionally not considered a biologic product, but in 2020, the FDA deemed it a biologic product because insulin is derived from human insulin genes. That gene is then placed into a bacteria or a yeast, and they produce large amounts of insulin. So they're derived from humans' bacterial yeast. They're produced using biologic processes. They're not chemically synthesized. So insulin are biologic products. You'll notice a lot of the medications have the ending MAB. If you see any medication that ends in MAB, it stands for monoclonal antibody. Monoclonal antibodies are things that our bodies produce as part of an immune response. These are large proteins, and so anything that ends in MAB is a biologic product. So how do biologics differ compared to conventional medications? Conventional medications, say atorvastatin, for example, this has a known structure that is easily characterized and copied, and so they're chemically synthesized. Compared to biologics, they're much larger, more complex molecules, which are derived from living organisms, whether that be humans, animals, or microbacteria. And then there may be slight variations from batch to batch. Because these are large, complex molecules, they may not be exactly identical between batches of biologics that are produced. And another key thing about biologics is they're often injectable products. About 15% of all medications are injectable products, but almost 100% of biologics are injectable products. So if you think back to this last slide, almost all of these medications are administered by some kind of IV or IM intramuscular route, and that's because biologics, because they're large and more complex, they're broken down much more easily if they were to be given orally, and then also they don't get absorbed in our guts well. So oral biologics, there's very few oral biologics. Rybelsus is one that you may think of as being an oral biologic. So if a biologic is a medication which is derived from a living source, what's a biosimilar? Well, a biosimilar is essentially the generic form of the original biologic. So it is the atorvastatin to the brand name Lipitor. So a biosimilar is a biologic medication that's highly similar to, so not exactly the same as, but highly similar to, and has no clinically meaningful difference from an existing biologic, which would be a reference product. So the reference product is essentially the brand name medication, and the biosimilars are, in a sense, the generic version of the original biologic. So compared with that reference product or original biologic, biosimilars are made with the same types of living sources, given to patients in the same way, have similar formulations, and have the same strengths, dosages, and treatment benefits. So some similarities of biosimilars to generic drugs: both are versions of brand name drugs and offer patients more affordable treatment options. Some differences is, again, the active ingredients in generic drugs are much smaller, simpler, and easier to copy, and biologics cannot be copied exactly. So sort of some of the similarities and differences between biosimilars and generic medications. So what's up with the nomenclature of biosimilars? Who decided on the YFGN, AGLR? What does that stand for? So biosimilar nomenclature, the FDA mandates that biosimilars should have the same core name as the reference product, and followed by a 4-letter distinguishing suffix at the end. And so multiple biosimilars that share the same reference product will each have a different distinguishing suffix. So for example, so insulin glargine, or Lantus, is the reference product. In comparison, Semglee and Resviglar are biosimilars of Lantus. They share the same core name, but their 4-letter distinguishing suffix differentiates them as being different from, or they're biosimilars of insulin glargine. What are some benefits of biosimilars? So similar to generic medications, they provide more treatment options for patients, increase access to life-saving or potentially life-altering or disease-modifying medications, and then they lower healthcare costs through competition. We'll look at a figure later about how generic medicines and biosimilars and like can decrease costs for patients, providers, insurers through competition. So some biosimilars, many of them are interchangeable. So an interchangeable biosimilar can be substituted at a pharmacy for the reference product without the need to contact the prescriber. So similar to if a provider were to prescribe, they write Lipitor on the prescription, but they don't check dispense as written, we could automatically substitute atorvastatin for that Lipitor. Interchangeable biosimilars are similar. Federally, we are allowed to automatically substitute that interchangeable biosimilar for a prescribed biologic. So the way this would look is that the doctor prescribes the reference product, the script would go to the pharmacy, the pharmacist would identify, hey, it appears that this patient's insurance prefers Semglee. They prescribed Lantus, but Semglee is an interchangeable biosimilar for Lantus, so I can interchange that biosimilar for the biologic without having to call the provider federally. And we'll talk about later that states can have more restrictive laws compared to what is federally allowed, and many states do have more restrictive requirements. But federally, we can interchange a biosimilar without needing to ask for permission from the provider or contact the prescriber. So if there's all these medications, all these biosimilars and biologics, where can we go to find them? How do I know that something is a biosimilar and what medicine it's a biosimilar of? Well, the FDA Purple Book database, which is available online for free, is the go-to reference. It contains information on all FDA licensed or approved biological products. It includes licensed biosimilars and interchangeable products. So you can see what is a biosimilar and what is an interchangeable biosimilar. And we'll take a look at what that search looks like. So you will go to the FDA Purple Book. You can search. So here I am again just sticking with what people are probably most familiar with as the most common biosimilar, but I search insulin glargine in the FDA Purple Book database, and then any biosimilar of insulin glargine will result. So we see that glargine, Lantus, Resviglar, Semglee, Toujeo, Basaglar, and we'll also see on the right side, you'll see 351A or 351K and interchangeable. We'll discuss where that comes from in a few slides. But so say we search and select insulin glargine for Lantus. It will show all biosimilars of insulin glargine. And the way it may appear a little bit more washed out in the main presentation compared to up here, but you can see that anything that results in the same color as insulin glargine, so you can see that Semglee, Resviglar, and Lantus are all green, so those are all interchangeable with one another. We could interchange those products at the pharmacy without needing to notify the provider. However, you notice that Basaglar is also insulin glargine, but it is not an interchangeable biosimilar. To become an interchangeable biosimilar, manufacturers have to specifically submit to the FDA to be an interchangeable biosimilar. And Basaglar has slight differences in the manufacturing process, and so it is not an interchangeable biosimilar. So if you were at the pharmacy, you saw that a patient's insurance preferred Basaglar, even though Lantus was prescribed, you would need to contact the prescriber to get permission to transition them from Lantus to Basaglar. You could not do that automatically. Toujeo also is not an interchangeable biosimilar. It is a biosimilar, but Toujeo has a different concentration compared to Lantus. Toujeo is 300 units per ml, whereas Lantus is 100 units per ml. So that would not be safe to interchange at the pharmacy without discussing with the provider. And then also, the results screen will show what formulations these medications are available in. So you see that, Semglee as well as Lantus are available in auto-injectors and multi-dose vials. Resviglar is only available as an auto-injector. so you can see what formulations they're available in. Okay, so now we know what a biologic and a biosimilar is. Let's take a look at some of the regulatory pathways for biologics and biosimilars. So the Public Health Service Act is what provides the authority to the FDA to regulate biological products. It's Section 351A and 351K, remember from the search a few slides ago, are for original biologics or reference products and biosimilars respectively. So original biologics are approved and licensed under Section 351A, and then biosimilars are licensed under Section 351K. So if we go back a few slides to our FDA Purple Book database, we can see all of the products that are listed on the right side as 351A. Those are original biologics, and then the agents that were licensed as 351K are biosimilars. So the Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research, also known as CBER, is the center within the FDA that regulates biological products. So they're responsible for pretty much all of the essential components of biologic and biosimilar regulation. That may include product regulation and approval, so ensuring the safety, purity, and potency of biologics and biosimilars. Post-market surveillance, so sometimes clinical trials don't always identify some of the adverse effects that may be associated with certain biologics or biosimilars. So the vaccine adverse effect reporting system is an example. So if adverse events are identified after FDA approval, it's the responsibility of CBER to conduct the post-market surveillance. Conducting research is important to better understand biological products and develop regulatory strategies. Policy and guidance development to follow and produce development, manufacturing and quality assurance, and then finally licensing establishments, licensing manufacturers, making sure that they're following good manufacturing practices as they are producing biologics and biosimilars. So this is an outline of the FDA approval process for biologic products. And so keep this in mind as we will later take a look at biosimilar approval. But this FDA approval process, from the time that a drug is identified to the time that it is approved for use in the market, can take 10 to 15 years, so a very long time. So we'll compare that to the biosimilar approval process. So preclinical studies is when the drug is discovered, may be used in animals to identify the adverse effects associated with the medicine. And then at that point, the manufacturer will submit an investigational new drug application, or IND. And that is where the manufacturer is stating how they're going to test this in humans, what the medication does, how they're manufacturing it. And that's when they'll conduct phase 1, 2, and 3 trials in humans to see what's the optimal dose of the medication, what are the adverse effects associated with the medication, is it effective for treating this disease state in question, and does it provide benefit that outweighs its risks. And after conducting those trials, which can take 6 to 8 years, the manufacturer will submit a biological license application to the FDA. The FDA will review that application, which can be 100,000 to over 1 million pages. And then at that point, the FDA will inspect the manufacturer to make sure they're compliant with good manufacturing processes and ensure they're compliant with all FDA regulations before finally, 10 to 15 years later, the FDA reaches a decision about whether or not that biologic can be approved for use in the market. And then that biological license application, this is what it includes. This is the request from the manufacturer to be able to enter a biologic into interstate commerce. But it must include applicant information, the manufacturing information and how they're planning on labeling the medication, and then the information from their clinical studies that they conducted. So if it takes so long to, from beginning to end, to have a biologic enter into the market, the idea and the goal of the 2009 Biologics Price and Competition and Innovation Act was to help provide patients with faster, greater access to effective biological medicines. So what they did in 2010, President Obama signed the BCPI Act, and this created an abbreviated pathway for biosimilars to be approved because If it was going to take 10 to 15 years for a biosimilar to be approved, then that would be much too long of a time before we're able to have effective biosimilars for patients to be able to use. So this pathway helps reduce the time and cost savings of development without decreasing the safety and effectiveness of the medication. So the biosimilar approval process, the goal is not to demonstrate superiority of the biosimilar, but to demonstrate biosimilarity, to demonstrate that it is clinically similar, it is not clinically different compared to the original biologic, not to establish independent safety and effectiveness. So the goal is just to identify that this medication is similar to the original biologic, that it is produced in a similar fashion, that it moves through patients in a similar way, and that structurally it's the same, or at least highly similar. So the data that they need to demonstrate biosimilarity, they need to do analytical studies to make sure that the medication is similar to the original biologic. They may use animal studies to evaluate the safety and adverse effect profile of the medication. And then they may also do a clinical study or studies, not as many as biologics have to do for FDA approval, but enough to demonstrate that the biosimilar moves through the body of the patient in the same way. And then also evaluating immunogenicity. We'll take a look at what immunogenicity means, but immunogenicity evaluates a patient's immune response to a biosimilar, and then any additional studies that the FDA deems necessary. So the FDA can guide the manufacturers as far as what information may be helpful when determining that a biosimilar is biosimilar enough to a reference biologic. And so some of the analytical studies, they may take a look at the far left to make sure that the biologic and biosimilar move through the patient's body similarly, that they have similar concentrations when they're administered, they're similarly effective, and then making sure that they have similar safety profiles, making sure that their immunogenicity is similar, and then that their adverse effect profile is similar. I mentioned immunogenicity. So biologics and biosimilar products, because they're large, complex proteins, there's a higher risk of our bodies identifying them as an outside source and mounting an immune response against them. Our bodies don't like foreign sources. They like the things that it creates itself. And so there is a risk with biologic and biosimilar products that your body will produce an immune response against that biologic product. Infliximab is a common biologic that does have this issue. But if your body produces antibodies against the biologic product, it can decrease its effectiveness by neutralizing that biologic. It can alter the kinetics and clearance of the medication and the way that our body distributes it. And it can cause hypersensitivity reactions if our body mounts an allergic response against that biologic. And so this is why biologics and biosimilars have to undergo rigorous immunogenicity testing to make sure that these are not significant risks associated with the medicines. And with a biosimilar, we want to make sure that there's similar risk of immunogenicity with the biosimilar compared to the biologic. So this is sort of the approach to immunogenicity testing. So they'll begin with a screening assay where they screen for the presence of various antibody production when the biologic is produced. If that is non-reactive, then they don't need to do further tests. But if antibodies are produced, they'll do a second confirmation assay. And if that is still reactive, then they'll do a titering assay where they're just evaluating the strength of our immune response against that biosimilar. And then also a neutralizing assay where they evaluate whether or not the immune response is specifically against the biologic or if it's to another component of the medicine that isn't going to impact the effectiveness of the biosimilar. So what does a biosimilar need to do to become interchangeable? Remember, we said that not all biosimilars are interchangeable and that they have to specifically seek FDA approval. Well, in addition to demonstrating that they are going to produce the same clinical result and have no greater risk of adverse effects, the bottom point is really the most essential one when demonstrating interchangeability. They have to evaluate the effects of switching back and forth between the reference product and the interchangeable biosimilar, because they don't want a patient to be changed from their biologic reference product to a biosimilar without notifying a provider, them not to be monitored appropriately, and then to have a response. And so to be able to be interchanged without notifying a provider, they want to make sure that that's safe to do so in clinical studies beforehand. So a switching study is where patients will switch back and forth between a reference product and a biosimilar. So they will compare patients that receive just the reference product to patients that switch back and forth between the reference product and the proposed biosimilar, and they want to make sure that there are similar outcomes between those groups and that there's no significant impact on immunogenicity. So this is an example of what that may look like. So you can see that all of the patients start by receiving the reference product, and then the control arm will continue just taking that original biologic reference product, whereas the other arm will switch back and forth between the biosimilar and the reference product. And what they want to assess is the drug similarly safe and effective compared to the patients that just received the reference product? And did they have any increased immune response against when patients switched back and forth? So what is required if a pharmacy wants to interchange a biosimilar? Well, it varies depending on state, as I mentioned before. So to be able to interchange a biosimilar without notifying a provider, it must have the designation of being an interchangeable by the FDA. So you can see that on the FDA Purple Book. And then you may need to notify the prescriber depending on individual state laws. We'll take a look at some maps to see what state laws may be. And then the frequency and time of notification of the provider varies by state as well. So some states it may be within 3 days, within 5 days. We'll take a look at that as well. Some states may require patient consent before you can interchange a biosimilar for a biologic. And then record keeping requirements vary between states as well. So this is a map of states that permit substitution of a reference biologic with an interchangeable biosimilar without needing to have prescriber authorization. So the ones in light blue are permitted to substitute the biosimilar without provider approval. But there are 4 states that do not permit this. So Washington, Indiana, Alabama, and South Carolina, you could not, regardless of what the federal law states, they have stricter laws that require you to get approval from the provider before exchanging a biologic with a interchangeable biosimilar. Some states may not require provider approval, but they require that you at least notify the provider. Send them some kind of message that says, hey, your patient's insurance, where we switch this patient from the prescribed biologic to the biosimilar for these reasons, we just wanted to let you know. And so this is required in most states. Most states require that you notify the provider that you make this switch, with the exception of Virginia and North Carolina. And then some states, most states require you to at least notify the patient of the change from the biologic to the biosimilar. So California does not require you to let the patient know. And then several states, the ones in white, do not specify, but all the ones in light blue require you to notify the patient that you've made this switch from a biologic to a biosimilar. And then I mentioned that the frequency and time to notifying the physician varies by state. And so most states require, see the 62% require notification, notifying the provider within 5 business days that you have made this switch. I believe Colorado is one of the 5 states that is within 3 business days. And then patient communication, as we mentioned, is mandatory within 45 states. So most states require you to notify the provider and notify the patient. Okay, so that is how biologics and biosimilars are regulated. What are some of the exciting impacts that they have made on our patients? So we recall some commonly used biologics and biosimilars. Adalimumab or Humira has been effective in treating arthritis and Crohn's disease. Alemtuzumab, beneficial in multiple sclerosis. Denosumab is a popular treatment option for patients with osteoporosis. Eczema, arthritis, psoriasis, asthma, prevention of RSV. So a lot of these disease states are disease states where previously or for many years there weren't excellent treatment options for patients, or not ones that really modified the disease process. And so after they were optimized on prior therapies, there really weren't any additional options. But these have created a lot of promising options for many disease states, which target the disease process more specifically rather than generally. And we'll take a look at a few examples of that. So biologics have really changed the landscape of cancer therapy. It is helping us target the cancer cells more specifically. So if we think of traditional chemotherapy, it targets cancer because it targets rapidly dividing cells. Well, unfortunately, our patient cells or many of our patient cells are also rapidly dividing, like our hair, our skin, the cells in our gut. So that's why a lot of traditional chemotherapies cause a lot of the side effects that we think about, such as hair loss, skinning of the thin, and mouth sores, nausea, and vomiting. So since a lot of our biologics can target the cancer more specifically and avoid targeting our body's natural cells, we can avoid a lot of those adverse effects. That's not to say that biologics don't have their own unique adverse effects, but we can minimize the collateral damage to healthy cells by using biologic medications compared to traditional chemotherapy. There's also more personalized treatments where we can target specific genes that cancers may possess. So for example, in breast cancer, certain biologics target tumor biomarkers such as trastuzumab is going to target HER2 positive breast cancer. So we can see if cancers are HER2 positive, estrogen receptor positive, et cetera, to personalize chemotherapy or cancer therapies more specifically to the patient-specific type of cancer. And a lot of biologics have demonstrated improved survival and progression-free survival for many different types of cancer. There are many new types of therapies on the horizon for cancer as well. That there are many studies. Their practice guidelines for cancer are probably updated more frequently than any other practice guideline, just because there are so many new cutting edge changes with medications and different types of therapies as it relates to cancer treatment. Things like immune checkpoint inhibitors make it so that our body can fight the cancer effectively. Cancer has resistance mechanisms that kind of turn off our body's ability to fight the cancer, and so these checkpoint inhibitors can make it so that our bodies can fight back. Viral immunotherapy, where genetically modified viruses that specifically target the cancer cells can be infused into patients to target the cancer. Adoptive cell transfer, where we take some of the host's living cells, modify them to be effective against the cancer. Cytokines are part of our immune response, and so there may be therapies where we can infuse cytokines for patients to mount a response against the cancer. And then cancer vaccines. There are many pipeline vaccines that hope to prevent the incidence of cancer. And then biologics and asthma therapy. So the mainstays of therapy in asthma and COPD are, of course, inhaled therapies. But what about these patients that are optimized on maximally dosed inhalers and they're still having symptoms? Well, we can do phenotype testing for patients with asthma to see do they potentially have like allergic asthma, eosinophilic asthma, or type 2 asthma, and then target it more specifically with medications that target those mechanisms of inflammation more specifically. And these have been shown to reduce exacerbations and symptoms for patients that have these types of asthma. And then finally, biologics and arthritis treatment. So arthritis is characterized by inflammation and damage to the joint, which can be very painful. The mainstay of therapy for many years were NSAIDs, things like diclofenac, Voltaren, ibuprofen, et cetera. But these really treat the symptoms of the inflammatory arthritis, but they don't prevent the progression of the joint destruction or deformity. And there's really not a lot of variability between the products. And we also need to avoid NSAIDs long-term in patients with certain disease states, such as if they have heart disease, kidney disease, if they have bleeding challenges. We want to avoid these in certain patients. So it can be risk-benefit as far as, are we going to continue them on these medications, which are helping their pain, but they increase risks in other ways, or do we not? Whereas disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, DMARDs, things such as etanercept, infliximab, tocilizumab, they can slow the progression of the disease process more specifically by using targets specific to arthritis. I mentioned cost savings with biosimilars compared to, in addition to biologics. So similar to how generic medications decrease prices for patients by price competition, so do biosimilars as it relates to biologics. And so if there's only one biologic and there's no biosimilars for that biologic, then that biologic has a monopoly on that market. Whereas if there's multiple biosimilars, then they have to compete with providers and insurers to be their buyers of the product. And so by decreasing the purchase price for providers and hospitals and offering additional rebates and pricing for insurers through this competition, we can decrease the cost for all members of the healthcare and all healthcare system, most importantly our patients. And so this has really led to a lot of savings since in just 2023, this is some data from the 2024 U.S. Generic and Biosimilar Medicine Savings Report. Savings in 2023 from biosimilar medicines was $12.4 billion in that 1 year alone. The total savings since the first biosimilar entered the market in 2015 is $36 billion, and a total days of patient therapy from biosimilar medicines has been $2.7 billion. So pretty significant impact on our patients and the cost savings for them and our healthcare system in just a short period of time. So in summary, so biologics are large, complex molecules that are made from living sources. And now I think many of us realize, oh, that we've actually, whether we realize it or not, have played a hand in dispensing biologic products. Biosimilars are highly similar to the reference product. They're not identical, but they have undergone enough testing to demonstrate that they move through patients similarly, that they have a similar benefit and no worse adverse effect profile compared to reference biologics. They have to specifically, biosimilars have to specifically seek FDA approval for interchangeability to be automatically interchanged without provider approval. The state requirements may be different. And then the FDA Purple Book is a great resource if you want to see what biosimilars are available for a biologic and whether or not they are interchangeable. The Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act in 2009 created an abbreviated pathway for biosimilars to be able to approve in a much shorter time span of about 6 to 8 years compared to that 10 to 15 years for an original reference biologic. And then finally, they've led to improved treatment options for many disease states. I only covered a few here. But there are many positive impacts of biologics for a variety of disease states and have led to biosimilars have led to significant cost savings as well. I have my references here. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration is a great resource in addition to the FDA Purple Book if you have any additional questions or want some additional reading. And I'm happy to field any questions you have. Yes. These? Okay, so assessment of the PK equivalence, pharmacokinetic means that the concentrations of the medications were similar between the biosimilars and the biologic products. And let's see, AUC is the area under the curve, and so the peak constant, it is the, if we were to measure, so there's no medication in the patient's system before we give the medicine, we can measure what the concentration is when that medication is peaked. We can kind of map out the curve, the area under that curve of the patient's exposure to the medication. The Cmax is the maximum concentration that our patient experiences after we give the medicine. So the higher the dose, the higher the Cmax would be. Yeah, and then BS is biosimilar, RP is reference product. So this is a switching study. Patients will receive the reference product. The control arm will continue to receive the reference product, whereas the switching arm, because we want to make sure that it's safe to switch patients back and forth between biosimilars and their reference product, the test arm will switch back and forth between them, and then we'll evaluate these parameters. Are the concentrations of the medication similar for that patient with the biosimilar product compared to the reference product? Yes. Wow. See, Humira. So I will admit that I'm not an arthritis expert, and but if I had a second to go to the FDA Purple Book, then we could see if those are biosimilars of one another. Are the generic names of them adalimumab with 4 letters? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, Humira is the reference product. And then, yeah, there's many biosimilars, and so I don't know all of the biosimilars. I listed some, but that would be the way to find out. Just go to the FDA Purple Book, type in adalimumab, and then once you get to the screen like this, you would see the reference products, adalimumab, and then all biosimilars of it, and then whether or not they're interchangeable, they would be in the same color. Yeah, I was looking at Humira to list as an example for the presentation, and it had like 12 actually. So I almost actually did Humira instead of Glargine for this search, but I thought that more people would have experience with Semglee and Resviglar. But oh, great. Okay. I believe Enbrel is a different medicine, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's etanercept. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Sorry, I don't know specifically because Humira has like 11 or 12 biosimilars. I don't know all of the biosimilar brand names, but that's a great question. Yes. There are fillers, but there are probably less fillers compared to an oral medicine. Sterile preparations have much fewer um, inactive ingredients. Pardon? Oh, okay. Some may contain polyethylene glycol, so it's important to check before using a biologic product if the patient does have a polyethylene glycol allergy to assess whether or not it does contain that. Yeah, so there are some inactive ingredients, but much less compared to the number of inactive ingredients in oral tablets. Other questions? Yes. So that is a loaded question. So Let's take Colorado, for example. So let's go to the map. So federally, yes, we could change to it without notifying the provider, and we wouldn't even have to communicate with them. Federally, we can do that. But states have more restrictive requirements. So since we're in Colorado, let's do Colorado. So in Colorado, for example, we could make a substitution without authorization by that prescriber that wrote the prescription for the Glargine or the Lantus, but we are required to at least notify them. But for example, my state of North Carolina, we could make that substitution and would not be required to even notify them. Though I know that the practice of many pharmacists is to notify them. So federally, yes, you can make that substitution. Statewide, it depends on your state as far as whether or not you are allowed to make that substitution without authorization by the provider. No, because it lists several options. It doesn't say you have to choose this option, but some specialty pharmacies may be connected electronically with all the prescribers that service them. So maybe they would just put it in the health record electronically or something like that. But others may, if it's a specialty pharmacy that services many different providers, they may just fax a lot of them. So, yes. So insurance so some patients' insurances prefer biosimilars over reference products. And so just the same as insurers prefer certain other generic medications over branded medications, or certain, we'll say, blood thinners over others. So certain insurances will prefer a biosimilar on their formulary compared to a biologic. So that would really be the case where the pharmacy would want to switch that patient, interchange it with an interchangeable biosimilar. Yes.
Great presentation, great detail. Question is about a pipeline biosimilar or biologic or a vaccine.
I think so. There's been several there's ongoing clinical studies for several types. I think that there were recent results of a few studies, and I believe it was gastrointestinal cancers where those vaccines were not effective. But it is, I believe, the more common cancer types, such as a gastrointestinal, breast, since those are some of the most common, possibly lung. But there's several different types. Yeah, I know. Yeah, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, has information on all ongoing clinical trials of medicines. So it's a great resource if you want to know what's currently going on in recruiting. Yes. They could, just the same as they could select dispenses written for certain medicines that aren't biologics. So they could. You wouldn't be necessarily like, it's hard to, getting into law, but I don't think you would be able to be sued in a court of law, because if they didn't specify dispenses written, then legally the FDA allows us to interchange them. But they could, but I would think that as long, they would just prefer whichever one's affordable for the patient. That's a really good question. Anything else?